Very much back to New York City, if I may say so, you having been here for some time in the past and so forth, and congratulations in advance on the film that you've been helping to put together, and we're going to want to talk about that and other matters, and so good to meet you, and welcome very much.
Thank you for having me.
And in the audience, a pleasure to welcome to the program Cliff Cobb. He is one of the he's with the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation, and it's a group of people interested, particularly seems to me, in the economic thinking of Henry George and the Georgia School of Things. And it was at their suggestion that the people who were the producers of a major film that is going to be shown here in Manhattan, I guess the day after we tape this program, and I congratulate you on doing. The title of that film is The End of Poverty, which is a very interesting title. I congratulate you on all of that work, and it's so good to welcome you to the set.
Well, thank you so much.
Wonder if you might personally share your own background a little bit, born and raised, that sort of thing, some of the education, and we could talk about some of the precursor things. It was at the suggestion, if I understand, that the editor of the film, or his name is Diaz, is
Philippe Diaz is
Philippe
the
Diaz
director. Mm-hmm.
was contacted by people of the Schalkenbach to suggest the film idea and so forth. But we'll be talking about that. But could you share your own personal background, born and raised, that sort of thing?
Okay, I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and our family moved to Southern California, which is where I grew up when I was about 7 years old. So I grew up almost entirely in California, which is why I don't have a Southern accent.
Okay.
My parents have some accent.
Yes.
I went to college, undergraduate at the University of Pacific. I went for a master's program at the University of California, Berkeley, in public policy.
Wonderful. The University of Pacific is a major university of autodidactic, progressive educational philosophy, if I'm not mistaken.
Well,
I think of it that way.
That may be, but I mean, it was divided into cluster colleges at the time I was there. It's changed.
Okay.
It's changed since that time.
Has
but
it?
The model was sort of like Santa Cruz and possibly like Oxford. I'm not sure how Oxford functions. But
tutorial?
Anyway.
Was it even tutorial?
Well, it was small classes, and the whole each of the cluster colleges was quite small. So.
Yeah, I have a sense. I don't know if there's a major campus in Stockton. I'm not sure.
It is in Stockton.
Yes, and I have a sense of great respect for the College of the Pacific, as I understand it. Particularly, it seems to be something in the order of Montessori or something, student-oriented or progressive in the best sense of the word. So congratulations in my thinking on that. And then you took a master's at Berkeley. So it was San Francisco. Were you raised in Southern California or in the Bay Area? Or
I was raised in the wasteland of Southern California.
Wasteland. I see, yeah. Orange County, maybe?
Not quite that much of a
not
wasteland.
That
not that bad. But,
okay, anyway. And then you were interested in public policy, and were you interested in economics and that sort of thing from an early pattern? And
well, actually, I got interested in issues of poverty and population growth and the environment all around the age of 18.
Really?
The year I graduated from high school in 1969. At that time, I read The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich.
Yes.
And even though that's not quite the way I think about things anymore, it was instrumental in awakening an interest in me. So I think it's important that books be written that actually inspire people, even if they're not entirely accurate.
Okay, well, he was. Would it be fair to say he was exerting what would be seen as a Malthusian view of population increase?
He's definitely a Malthusian. Yes.
Yeah, and that was something a lot of people were worried about. People seem less to be worried about that, although we're heading for 7 billion, aren't we? And so forth. But that's a big issue.
Well, one of the things I finally concluded was, even if population is a problem, the way to solve it is indirectly. The efforts that have been made to directly solve the problem by punishing people for having too many children haven't worked. In India, they tried it and it completely failed, and the government broke down as a result of it. So
really, yeah.
Even if it were the right thing to do, morally, which I don't think it is, it doesn't work practically.
Now,
So
what is it that doesn't work properly? Trying to use
trying to force people not to have children.
yeah.
The effective way to do it, historically, is a kind of, wasn't intentional, but by restricting housing supply in Eastern Europe, they cut their birth rates below the death rate, so they actually had negative population growth. Again, I'm not saying that's the way to do it, but the point is it was that indirect influence that was actually effective by limiting the availability of housing, so that since adult children were still living with their parents, they were unable to form new families, so they didn't want to have children, so they were delaying childbirth for a long time, and the housing shortage meant they didn't want to have large families.
Yeah.
I think, in fact, in Japan, for example, they have zero population growth.
Yeah.
And that has largely to do with just the very tight accommodations, even though they're well off financially, I mean, economically, but still it's very costly to raise a child in the city. So.
Yeah. That, or the industrial thing, yeah. And of course, Malthus said that the population will grow geometric, and their means of providing will grow arithmetic, and they were heading for that. And then there was and then you had people coming along and saying, in agricultural communities, people would have 12, 13 children, and half of them would die because there was such grinding poverty and so forth. And then when the industrialization came and that sort of thing, the families tended to be, through their own volition, smaller. And that the places
urbanization is probably the single biggest factor in limiting population growth.
And industrialization and the Industrial Revolution go together in a sense in terms of the technology. Were you ever involved with Mr. Schumacher and the Small is Beautiful movement, or have you thought of that? Or
I believe I heard him speak once, but I don't have any connection directly with the
Club of Rome, the thinking of it was coming off a Malthusian view of things and so forth, but that's a very grim picture of human potential, and yet I heard you say they were trying to force people not to have families. People decided not to have families, large families, as they had in the past, out of their own volition, but that was instituted by policies by the powers that be and so forth?
Not necessarily policies. Urbanization and the constriction of the housing market were not necessarily policies. They just happened to work out that way for various reasons. And it isn't necessarily a function of poverty, Japan being a good example of that.
Yeah.
And I suspect that's the main reason for the slowdown in population growth in the United States among the native-born population, is that we became an almost entirely urbanized society, say after 1950. And it's essentially rural areas that have historically always been the net producers of population growth, and urban areas for several thousand years, I think, have been net losers of population. So they don't even reproduce themselves. So as a society moves from being predominantly rural to predominantly urban, population growth declines on its own.
And I think that dynamic comes along with industrialization. Generally, the Industrial Revolution and the modern movement into the modern economic order and so forth, that Mr. George looked at, among others, I think, and the implications of that. I can't remember the name of the person who informed the intellectual force behind the limits to growth. It'll come to me in a
Jay Forrester, is that?
Jay Forrester. Thank you for the name. I remember doing a program with him. And if I may, just talking to him, because I was very taken with our Buckminster Fuller, Richard Buckminster Fuller, McLuhan, and some of that. And Jay Forrester and Mr. McLuhan was anticipatory design science. Through good design, we can do more with less. Ephemeralization, it's a possibility. We don't have to pollute the environment, the satanic mills of William Blake and so forth, as we had to. And that through good design, we were able to do more with less. Ephemeralization, good design. And he also had a reading through World Design, the Design Science Decade, 65, 75, that the percentage, and I wonder if you could agree with this, that if we were to look at the trending of world population, and then try to measure things in terms of our capability of providing life support, not only the needs but also the reasonable and growing wants in a reasonable pattern of the population of the world, that because of technological capability and augmentation of the productive process, there was a higher percentage of people on a world system scale who could realistically be seen to be haves, if we could ever get at a definition of what we measure that by, through time, that there's a higher percentage of haves are able to be seen in realistic terms because of the technological advance of good design capability. There are more haves than there would have been historically if we look back through the human experience. In terms of capability.
Well, in terms of production capabilities, I'm sure that's true.
Yeah.
We're far more productive than 300 years ago or even 50 years ago.
Yeah, and that those terms, so that you could say on a world scale, as Fuller did in the World Design, he said that we came out of history, and he was looking at the 20th century. He said in his reckoning, world design capability and population trends and technologies and that sort of thing, he said that in his reckoning we'd come out of a thing where it was always less than 1% in terms of the capability and the population reality, and that by the time we got to about the First World War, we had gotten to the point where maybe 10% of the world population might be realistically seen to be able to be haves in a growing thing. By the Second World War, it was carefully calibrated and thought out very carefully, and by non-ideologically larded thinking. And by the Second War, we'd gotten to a point where there was about 20% of the world population could be seen to be haves in terms of our abstract technological capability of providing life support for the human society within an ecological context. And he projected from 1952, a 20-year period, to all human institutions that we've inherited out of history. So that would have taken us to about the year 1972, that we had a 20-year period when we were going to cross the 50% mark in terms of our capability of providing technologically augmented, good design. This is pre-cyber, even, that kind of thing. And he let out his life. He ended his life thinking that we did cross that 50% mark about the year 1970, at the period which was the 60s, Woodstock, Vietnam, all of that sort of thing was blowing in. Bobby Dylan said some big change was going. That we were there, and that that we have a capability that has not been characteristic of history in terms of population demands and needs, and that we were crossing that line. In a certain sense, that would be a formula for saying we are transcending, in a certain sense, material scarcity as an ontologic reality in terms of assigning meaning or design to our human institutions. And I remember that would be, do you understand what I'm saying? Do you think that makes any sense? Or is that waxing too philosophical or too outside the bounds of what could be possibly reality?
I don't think we're transcending material limits.
No, if I may. Crucial distinction. We're not talking about the reality. The reality we've inherited out of historical context is what we are talking about in our politics and so forth, and most economic theory, but it's at the level of capability. We have a capability that was evolving with the Industrial Revolution, agricultural, green revolution, things that were coming, and also particularly if we use good design in order to have ephemeralization of doing more with less. One example that was destined to emerge would be the computer, the superconductor, and transit, all the way down the line to a nanotechnology that's coming now, that sort of thing. The capability that we had gathered through technological development and through understanding of things was growing, not the reality, if you understand that the institutions we inherited were done in a certain context. What he was talking about was a qualitative transformation that might make possible the end of poverty, which is the theme of your film. And also, I just wonder if that makes any sense or not to you.
Well, my general view is that almost every technology has a dark side.
Okay.
So that whatever increase in productivity it brings tends to have some offsetting problems.
Okay.
And in fact, a great deal of the problems we face today are of our own design.
I would think so.
They're problems created by technology. I mean, for example,
yeah,
the possibility of destroying ourselves with nuclear weapons is entirely a human invention.
Could I ask you that? Could it just follow up? And I'm going to stop talking, because if you look at it existentially, that seems to be the case now. We've been here 200,000 years as a species, projecting our capability, creating technology, and there's modeling that the weapon systems, unlike as recently as the Second World War, if there was to be unleashed in a spasm of hatred, seem to be, particularly weapons we maybe don't even know about, germ, things that are done in order to gain advantage by one group over another and so on, are now species lethal. Do you believe that is existentially the new reality that has only applied sometime after the year 1945 in terms of the historical pattern? Major existential alteration in terms of our capability again.
I think that's true, and I think it's affected the psychology of everybody on the planet.
Thank you. I think that's major, don't you?
To know that we can destroy ourselves is a radical break in history.
Within our lifetime, that was not the case. That's exactly the point that Mr. Fuller was trying to bring out with his thing, saying that the averse side of the destructive scenario, which is existentially able to be examined by modeling only, we can't test it, hoping that there'll be a couple of people survive in New Guinea if let's just blow everything up like we've done with alarming firebombing Dresden and all the rest of the kind of things we've been doing. You understand what I'm saying? So we live in a time of qualitative transformation, a capability at the level of capability, both on the destructive side and perhaps on the liberating side, or on the side of addressing, maybe in our time, we have the capability to address the poverty question that was not capable of being addressed in any qualitative way, say in the 6th century, the 8th century, the 14th century, or any time until the time that you and I sit and talk in this studio now.
Now, that I would disagree with.
I
don't think it requires technology to deal with the problem of poverty.
You do not, okay.
I mean, one example that in the 20th century was the state of Kerala in southwestern India.
Yeah, very Christian.
The per capita income was not very high. It may have been, I don't know, maybe $400 or $500 a year, something like that.
Okay.
So that's not very high, and yet they had an infant mortality rate that was only somewhat higher than industrialized countries.
Okay.
And a life expectancy rate that was, in fact, it was higher than among African Americans in this country.
Huh, okay.
They were approximately the same as China under Mao Zedong. So you can have an egalitarian form of low income that is accompanied by high life expectancy rates and fairly high levels of nutrition and so on. Now, you don't have the technological gadgetry that a lot of people think of as progress. So I'm not saying these are ideal conditions, but I am saying that it is not necessary to have high levels of technology. If you have an egalitarian social system, you can have a fairly comfortable living situation for most of the people in society. I
see. Okay. Does that take it into account, the whole evolutionary process of which we are a part, so that haveness, we say haveness, isn't just eating food or having egalitarianism? You could have steady state, and you would just stay at the same place. You don't do anything. It took decades to invent a tack in the Middle Ages. Things were stagnant. It was steady. Maybe it could be. Do you understand what I'm saying? But there's a dynamic process. And is there any purpose to, let's say, biological process in this part of the universe against which you could posit these things? And then does it take into account anything along the line of knowledge? We didn't know about, it doesn't matter, we didn't know about neurotransmitters 30 years ago, the way the brain works. We're now coming to understand it. We're understanding more and more all the time. That's technologically driven to a large degree. The genome we have now, that's technologically driven and has consequences. But you think that's not so important as the means by which there could be egalitarianism within a country, a society? And has there ever been one since civilized time that was really, truly egalitarian?
Well, I gave two examples of highly egalitarian
well,
societies.
that one society in Kerala
and China from 1949 until 1976 was highly egalitarian. both at a very low level of income.
Okay.
And China said, we're not going to do that anymore. We want to raise our level of income. And in the process, they have created one of the most, not one of the most, but anyway, a very highly unequal society. The measure of inequality in society doubled between 1979 and well, maybe 10 years after that. I mean, it just very quickly became a two-class society in China.
Has been the case with practically all of human history, from the emperors of Rome to the kings of medieval, empires, Oriental despotism. James Joyce said history
European despotism too.
In European, in general,
not just Oriental.
And it leads one to some poets and people who begin to take account of things. And James Joyce said, "That'll say history is a nightmare from which I'm attempting to awaken." You think of the satanic mills and the awfulness of Dickensian England and what had to be done and so forth for us to get to this point of quality. There was no way we could have destroyed the species when Kerala was doing well, and it wouldn't do Kerala with their equality any good if other people then blew up the whole species, which included them. So matters of qualitative change that's suggested in your film, the end of poverty, there's always been poverty. There's always been injustice, almost in terms of the evolution of society. It seems to me it's always been a few who run things and have the ownership and the power.
Maybe I should say a few words about the title of the film.
Thank you. Maybe you should, and I'll let you talk. I'm sorry.
It's a little. The title of the film is "The End of Poverty?" ?
Oh, thank you for the question mark.
And then there's a tagline: "Think again." In other words, this isn't the end of poverty.
Okay.
It's actually in a response to a best-selling book by Jeffrey Sachs.
Oh yeah.
Who's a professor at Columbia.
Oh yeah.
And he wrote a book called The End of Poverty, in which he argues effectively that with good macroeconomics, it's possible to achieve economic growth in every society, and with economic growth there will be a decline in the total number of the amount of absolute poverty. That means the people living at the very bottom will be lifted up. So it's a rising tide lifts all boats kind of philosophy. And the central philosophy of the movie is that, in fact, poverty isn't a function of people not being able to grow enough food or to create things. The problem is that powerful people take away what the poorest people can produce, or block their attempts to produce by taking away the land or other resources from which they could produce. An example of this in the movie is some mines in a small area of Tanzania that produce tanzanite. I never even heard of it before this, but anyway. And at one point, a lot of small-scale miners were mining in this area, and then as a result of pressure from either the World Bank or the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the nation of Kenya, the government, was required, in effect, to open this up to multinational corporations, which moved in and effectively took over a lot of the mining area. And these small-scale miners say, if we're underground and we happen to come into a vein that's being controlled by them, by the big company, we may get killed. This is a life and death matter for them. And this is a kind of parable of the way the world works, that resources tend to be controlled by very large interests, and in a monopolistic fashion, and other people are forced out. And then they're allowed to come and work for the big company at a very low wage. But they're not allowed to work on their own. They're not allowed to dig their own resources, mine, and fisheries are another example. Increasingly, those are taken over by big fishing fleets, and small-scale fishers are forced out.
Agribusiness is another. You got a combine that can produce, family farms, and everybody had to go to Detroit because it was a major occupation in the United States, turn of the 19th, 20th century. It was individual family farm. Now it's 2% can feed the world with combines. And the combines are all owned by a small group of people. And the people have nothing but a labor relationship to the production in terms of the trends that are... He did shock therapy in the Soviet Union. He also did
who's
Oliver
he?
Sacks. You were talking about. Are you
Hmm.
celebrating Oliver Sacks or questioning his theory?
Jeffrey Sachs.
Jeffrey Sachs. I'm sorry. I was thinking of
Yes.
the
Oliver
neurologist.
Sacks is a different,
that's another
different
Sachs,
field, yes.
another good guy.
Yeah, we are
everything.
questioning what Jeffrey Sachs is saying.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, because he had shock therapy in the Soviet. I don't think it worked terribly well.
That's correct.
They got a GDP about Portugal now, I think, what was a great empire.
And their life expectancy rate actually declined.
Down 55 or something.
So,
yeah,
no,
yeah,
it was a dramatic catastrophe.
He also did some things down in Bolivia.
That's correct.
I spent a year and a half down there. I know what that's like.
He destroyed their economy, and now he's trying to help Africa.
In the name of addressing the poverty question in that. So that model, you do have people in the film, Mr. Stiglitz, talking. He's somebody who brings some critique to it and so forth. And you also have the example, being Schockenbach and so forth, that isn't well enough understood of the Georges and Henry George and his take on things. Is it a major part of the film, or you addressed the director to produce the film from the Schockenbach, from a Georges perspective, and is it well enough understood, or maybe you could share a little bit of the way Henry George saw things back in the 19th century and so forth, and is it relevant to what is a good critique of, let's say, the Jeffrey Sachs view of the world, or the view of the world of our largely our political leadership, either the American capitalist model or the Chinese capitalist model? Looks awfully like capitalism to me in a traditional thing,
The central concern of the dominant economic view is that whatever can be done to increase overall productivity, aggregate production, to increase GDP, that is the driving force, and that everything should be geared towards that. And the question of distribution is always treated as a secondary question. And that may be the central issue that Henry George was raising, that the distributional question is equally important. And ironically, if you create a system in which everyone participates, in which no one is left out, it will actually increase productivity. So really, the idea of this lopsided sort of growth, where you have growth that benefits a tiny portion of the population, the rest of the population isn't even able to buy things anymore, and that actually it creates an unintegrated economy. And so it actually weakens the economy.
Yeah, they ought to be in tandem.
Yes.
Supply and demand, or ability to clear the market, if only in actual terms, by the people, should be there for them to do it, and it hasn't been because of accumulation, of the need to capital accumulation, or what's the reason that the capitalist model would not allow this to happen, or it isn't happening on a world scale sufficiently to what the times require?
Well, Henry George's argument, which has not been widely accepted, is that the central issue is not the accumulation of capital, but the accumulation of land.
Okay.
Now, to most people today, that seems unintelligible, because they think, when you say land, they assume that means farmland.
Yeah.
But in fact, the most valuable land in the country is
Manhattan.
right here, right under us. The taller the building, more likely the more expensive the land is underneath it.
Yeah, okay.
In fact, I one time checked, and a single acre at Times Square was more valuable than all the land in Albany.
No kidding, really?
So I just mean the extremes are can be found right there.
So he didn't mean just land in terms of land like agriculture.
What he meant was the value of real estate.
The value
and most of the value of real estate
okay.
lies in the land, at least in cities. Obviously, in the countryside, the land may be, in some cases, worth less than some buildings. But in any case, in the city, in Manhattan, probably overall in Manhattan as a whole, around 2/3 of the value of the real estate is land, and 1/3 buildings, something like that.
2/3 is land. I don't quite understand why. I don't understand what you just said.
Well, let's say you've got a piece of land worth $2 million and a $1 million building on it. That's what I'm saying. The total value of that property, land and building, would be $3 million, and the land itself might be worth $2 million, and the building would be...
How is that determined? Why is the land worth so much when it's the building? You've got a 100-story building and so forth, seems to me it's going to be more valuable than the 10 acres it sits on.
Well, actually, the Empire State Building, at one time, the land and the building were sold separately.
Okay.
And in that particular case, I believe that the building was sold for about twice the value of the land. So that in that particular building, but if you go down to 42nd Street or 34th Street and look at all the around there, all the other buildings are maybe 10, 15 stories.
Yeah, right. Okay, right
In
enough.
every one of those cases, because they're right next to it, the land value per square foot is approximately the same as the land value under the Empire State Building.
Okay.
So in each one of those cases, the land is probably worth 8 times the value of the building.
And this was crucial to his view of economics.
Yes.
The value and the tax, or okay, maybe we could spell it out a little bit more, because it seems to be, it was very, very popular at the turn of the century. Teddy Roosevelt, Tolstoy bought into it.
That's correct.
Mark Twain, I think a number of people did. And he was a major, major figure. And you feel, of course you do, as Schalkenbach, that he's still relevant, should be listened to and given credence to our decision makers and the general population, I presume.
Yes. Well, one reason we should be giving it credence, I'm going to hold up. This is a book.
Let me hold it, and then they'll come in and type.
Okay.
Okay, here. There's a book. You can come in tight on it. Talk to us, please.
This is a book I recently edited. It's based on the writings of Mason Gaffney, who's an economist at the University of California, Riverside. He has been writing essays about Mason Gaffney, about Henry George for decades, and not only about Henry George. He's also...
Wasn't he at the Schalkenbach for a while?
He was on the board of the Schalkenbach
Yes,
Foundation
indeed, here in New York. Yeah, right, okay. This is after the crash, right?
But the thesis of this is that we had recent evidence between 2000 and 2006. There was a buildup of housing prices.
Yeah, right.
A housing bubble.
That's right.
That was widely recognized, and yet somehow the fact that this depression we're in followed immediately after the crash of that housing bubble has all been blamed on Wall Street. But in fact, this process of a dramatic increase in the price of land, which is really what we're talking about.
The housing bubble. Yeah.
The housing bubble really is a land price bubble.
Okay.
And let's go back to the 1920s.
Okay, please. Yeah. Can I take this down now?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
That's a very interesting book. I appreciate that. I really would like to see that. Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
In the 1920s, this process happened previously. We could learn from that because the same thing happened between 1990 and 2006. But between 1920 and 1926, housing prices also went up into a bubble and then collapsed. And immediately, it wasn't so obvious because right as that collapse was taking place, there was a commercial real estate bubble that was taking place.
Okay.
And that one burst in 1929.
Okay, right. That was the beginning of
what
was called the Great Depression.
Right, and that was the beginning of the Great Depression. So we have this pattern of housing price bubble followed by commercial real estate bubble, both of them crashing, bringing those prices down, and the real estate market collapses. And as a result, because the banking system is tied to the real estate system, it meant that the assets of banks were tied up in real estate they couldn't sell. And because the banks, in a sense, no longer had loanable assets, they stopped lending to small businesses, which is exactly what's been going on for the last 2 years now.
Okay.
Same process. This process has gone on approximately every 18 to 20 years since 1800.
1820. I was thinking of a 30 year.
1837, 1857, right before the Civil War, probably a factor in the Civil War. 1873, 1893, 1912, 1929.
Sure enough.
Or 1933. So, I mean, the cycle has been somewhat muted since the Second World War.
Because of Keynes, or?
It's only been muted. It hasn't been completely dispensed with. We've had depressions in the early '80s, for example, and in 1990, the early 1990s, there was a crash in the housing market again then, but all of it sort of seems to have come together in this one. There was a kind of perfect storm of various factors.
Yeah, it was, if I may, it was a major way in which, let's say, lower or lower middle class people were able to gain net worth, was the appreciation and the value of their one piece of capital they own, which is their residential home.
Yes.
You'd buy it for $100,000, it'd be worth $200,000, and you got a growth of net worth through that for the people. That's the way a lot of people saw it, and it was seen that way, and people were, ordinary people were getting involved in that. We tried to let everybody get in on that to the degree that we could with FHA, other kinds of procedures, But there was a bubble that grew up.
Yeah, that was all false value. It was simply people bidding up. It wasn't creating anything because the land didn't change, and the value of the buildings actually goes down during these times.
It does, really?
Well, yes.
I can't make that. I have a hard time.
The building is deteriorating. The building is a physical structure that over time will turn to dust. It may take 100 years. Some of the poorly built buildings may last only 30 years. But the building is not increasing in value.
Well, it would be increasing in value if you bought it for $100,000 and you went into a bank with good, honest-to-God American dollars and got $200,000 10 years after, 5 years after you bought it. That would be value that you would realize in your bank account.
There's no question that the
net
property,
worth,
the property increased in value.
Right.
But the property consists of two things. It consists of the land, the location where it's built.
It's built on a quarter acre, let's say. Yeah.
But
the
question
that's where you say all the land has all the value.
The question is where. It's the location that has value.
Okay.
It's not the dirt that has value. It's where it is.
Okay.
If it's on Broadway, it has more value than it does on...
If it's in the middle of Nevada, it's a different proposition.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's all a question of location.
How are those land values determined?
Well, they're determined by the market.
Yeah, okay.
By where people want to locate their business, where they want to live, where they want to have entertainment. Around Disneyland, that's a very, very valuable place, too. So, it's not just...
Right.
So whatever produces something that people want, then people want to be, somebody wants to live near there, or have a shop near there. All of those things increase the value, and those values are found in the form of land value.
Okay.
Now, we don't say that generally. We talk about property values. We talk about real estate. And therefore, there's the illusion somehow that these buildings are increasing in value. But the bricks are slowly eroding.
Wait a minute. Suppose you have on top of this quarter acre a factory that houses a corporation like, say, Google. And they have a lot of value by realizing market value to a world market or something. And that value that they add to it, other than the dirt, is of some significance in terms of a business model that brings in a great deal of money into a bank account that makes them wealthy, and that gives it value. What I'm saying is not just the dirt, or the
it's not the dirt. It's the location, but
the location.
But the Silicon Valley.
But suppose they were down the road from Redwood or wherever they are. They were down the other place, then there would be value there. And is that reflected, and is it relevant in terms of the economy as opposed to what it is that they actually produce and how they relate to the world economy, taken large? Whether it's on plot A or plot B a mile down the road? Does it make a difference?
Well, a mile down the road.
It's not the dirt that makes the difference.
It's the location.
It's the location of what they do.
It's the synergy of people acting together in a region that tends to create that value.
Right.
And it's not any one business that does it. It's the interaction of all of them.
Right.
And if you go to Silicon Valley and want to buy a house, you'll find out just how expensive that land is.
They're more expensive because they're in tandem with an industry.
Right.
Like I lived in Detroit.
And also because the incomes of the workers there are high enough that they then bid up the real estate, the land value in that area. And so lower income people, meaning people earning under, say, $60,000 a year, that's low income in that area. They have to drive 60 or 100 miles to work every day
jobs
because they have to live so far away they can't afford to live any closer.
Right. Okay. Now this is all relevant to a Georgist view of things.
Yes.
Spell it out a little more. I'm trying to understand. I have a little hard time understanding it. And where does he fit into the canon of economic theory that informs the political process and so forth?
Well, in some ways, Henry George's ideas are fully accepted by economists, but in other ways, they're entirely ignored.
How are they
It's
accepted?
rather difficult to figure out the
a conundrum.
Sort of,
That's all we need.
Paradoxical.
Yeah.
In 1990, about 20 economists, many very well known, some Nobel Prize winning economists, signed a statement that was a letter, an open letter to Mikhail Gorbachev, suggesting that as a transition took place in Russia, they should not simply privatize everything. They should keep land in the hands, and also oil and timber and so on.
Okay, that's
natural resources.
Okay. Natural resources
in the
should
hands,
be collectively owned.
Collectively owned, or they could be owned and leased, or privately held and taxed.
Oh, okay.
Either one of those two. They're equivalent.
That's a certain form of taxation, land value tax or something?
Right, to tax the value of the land, or to own the land and lease it to people at the market value.
That was the Georgia thing.
And a large number of economists signed the statement. They agree in principle that this is the best way, this is the best form of taxation.
Why have we not done that if it makes eminent good sense?
Well, first of all, it's a lot easier to say you over there in Russia ought to do it than that we ought to do it ourselves.
Okay, right, okay, yeah.
People who own a house and they own the land under it, if we started taxing the land, the value, the selling price of that property is going to go down. And just as you were saying, a lot of people see the value of their life's asset is their house and the land under it.
That's been the case with most because they don't have any other ownership.
And as a result, if you start talking about reducing that value, they feel very threatened by that. They think you're taking away their retirement income.
Because, well, that has been in the mind. That's been a way for them to gain some net worth for most of the people in the lower echelons of the society, and it gives them a sense of some security.
It actually isn't mostly lower echelons of society.
It isn't, no?
In any given city, in the metropolitan area, you will generally find that about 70% of the value of the land is owned by about 20% of the people.
20%, that much?
Yeah, but 70%, that means 80% of the people own 30%. And that means a lot of people don't own anything.
Yeah, right.
And a lot of people own a house, but they really don't own it. The bank owns it.
Yeah.
Effectively, because they've got a mortgage on it that's so huge that
they
they're
used
never
to
going to
have
pay
a
it
big
off.
event when they'd burn the mortgage. It doesn't happen that much because
they
got and they got all these other things that have entered into it. So we've got and he felt, if I wanted, that natural resources, the resources should be collectively owned by everybody. Now that's not the case.
Well,
we
he
have drilling
actually
rights and that sort of thing, and we have the rights to extract and on private property and things that have come in. But am I correct in that he had the view that the natural resources of the world should be owned by everyone in a certain way, or am I off base on that?
He would have said the value should be should that everyone in society should benefit from that value. He did not believe in collective ownership because he saw that collective ownership would mean collective management, and that's generally not very well done.
Not usually, yeah.
So he wasn't.
That can't shoot
he recognized that you want individual ownership and individual management, but then he said, you don't have to take physically control the property. You simply tax away the value that comes from nature, and leave people the value that they add with labor
their own
and capital.
effort. Oh, I see.
So he didn't want to take the property. He wanted people to use it in its highest and best use, and then to tax away that part of it which came from location. In other words, just the value of owning that location is one thing, and it's worth as much. I mean, if whoever owns it should pay that. Just in the same way, when you use 1,000 gallons of water, you pay for that water.
Yes.
In the same way, he's saying, when you use land, and the way you use land is simply by occupying it. There's no flow through the way there is water. But by occupying that land, you are depriving everyone else in the world of that site. So what you're doing is you're compensating society for having monopolized use of that site. For whatever you're going to use it for, you ought to pay for that annually, Not one time and pay the former owner, but you're keeping that, you're depriving everyone else in society of a value of that location that's created by society. The reason that site is valuable is because everybody else wants to be there or around it.
That's a whole vision. That's a whole vision of the economy in a very macro way, right?
Yes.
That he had. And it was generally accepted by a great number of people. And there would have been interests against that. There would have been interests, call them selfish or interests, that would not want to see that kind of a society because they benefit mightily by something other, more along what we actually see when we look at what we call reality.
Well, there have always been interests going back to the beginning of civilization that wanted to monopolize and control and have other people work. I mean, you know, if I don't have to work, somebody else will do the work for me. Why not do that?
Yeah.
Of course, that requires a level of violence to maintain that system,
and
that's always
that's
been
the world
case.
that we have. And the developed world can exploit the underdeveloped or poorer section of the world. And in each of the societies, we had 192 countries in the world, nation states, and in each of them, the ownership of the capital assets are held by a relatively very small group of people. And with the labor theory of value, the people are imbued with the sense that the way for them to get income to buy bread and maybe a little piece of pound cake on Sunday every once in a while, they will have what they call a job. And the capital assets embody a great deal of land values and also technology, wealth producing, capital instruments, and they're all owned by a tiny group of people who set the template for practically all of our institutions, which benefit those who own and have that leadership element on a world scale in each of the political entities around the world. And it's not going to work in terms of eliminating poverty. It's only going to create it, and that we need some sort of a change is one of the themes of Henry George and also of your movie.
That's correct.
Okay.
I would say the most fundamental problem about talking about poverty in this society is the immediate assumption that people have if they see a poor person, they want to explain poverty in terms of the characteristics of that person.
Oh yeah, the flaws.
We tend to individualize our explanations of any problem and see it, and of course every person has flaws. So you can find flaws and then say that must be the reason the person's poor.
You have flaws? I'm shocked. There's gambling in Casablanca. Yeah, I got a flaw or two, too, yeah. No, I understand.
So, but this individualistic approach to thinking about poverty prevents people from even imagining that there's an overlying structure that says about 20 to 30% of the population is going to be struggling, or 60 to 70%. And that's not because of those individuals. For example, we have economists say we don't want the unemployment rate to go down below 5 or 6%, something like that, or we'll have high levels of inflation. They argue. Yeah. I don't want to dispute that issue. But based on that assumption, they say we have to have 5% unemployment. Now, in fact, the average length of unemployment is about 17 weeks, or 1/3 of a year. So that means about 15 to 18% of the population has to be unemployed at least part of the year for the economy to function. That means those people are left out.
A lot of suffering.
But that's created by the system.
Yeah, right.
Somebody's got to take the fall for it. Who's going to take it is a random kind of event to some extent. Although the professional class tends not to be as unemployed as people who do manual labor. So we put this burden on people and then we blame them. And say they're responsible for being homeless. They're responsible for not being able to take care of their families, and that's what's nonsense.
Right.
And that's true in this country, and that's true on a global basis.
Right, and that's true of every country in the world.
Yes.
We do not have a just system in terms of realizing like 100 trillion cells in the human organism, they all matter. Everybody matters, but we do not treat them right. All of our wisdom schools have said we should, and we haven't. We haven't come up with a system. We still don't have a system that's adequate to what the future requires if we're going to avoid the Gadaramidung unleashing of hatred and violence and weapon systems that could get more and more into the hands of some of these people and so forth. So we live at a time of qualitative transformation, and we do not have the vision needed in order for what the future requires in terms of an equitable distribution and an involvement of everybody in an economic order that would be, in a certain sense, liberating. We don't have that vision in terms of our canon. Lord Keynes said in a letter to his grandchildren, you may remember, if I could, that in the letter to his grandchildren in their maturity, which would be about now, that you are going to be confronted with something that is hard for you to imagine, off a labor theory of value and so forth, because we worship at the level, at the altar of a labor, seems to be, at least that they're going to earn their keep. People who own capital assets or own let's say an automated factory or something of that sort, they own that. They get income even though they don't do anything. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now, that's all owned by a tiny group in every political economy around the world. They set the template for, and everybody has to be sycophant to that, and then they have to have what they call a job. Keynes said you're going to be confronted, the maturity of the generation of our grandchildren, 1930, with something that's hard to imagine. Massive, technologically induced unemployment is going to be, you're going to have a tremendous productive capability, and you're not going to need wage slaves, as the Marxists would call it, or workers, and yet in every economy, the only way we have to distribute income legitimately to the people is through their having what they call a job, much like a serf on a feudal estate had to do in the feudal times. That's the situation that we just accept. And we don't accept any way of relating the people through an ownership stake of the instruments of production or the instruments of economic power in any kind of a way, because it seems to be, for some reason, all that power has to reside in the hands of a few, and everybody else are going to be treated like serfs on a feudal estate in each of the political economies around the world. And it seems to be accepted by the political people in power, and also the people sycophant to them within the media and all the institutions that are formulated on a system coming out of history. We need something new that could be liberating of everybody to be able to realize their own potential without having that kind of a situation be available to us only in terms of we look at what the future requires. It's just a rough. Is your film suggesting that? Does Henry George suggest that? If we were to suggest it, is it have a liberating vision for the human society? Or is that something that is idealistic and beyond the realm of ever having a just order rather than the unjust order, which all of this capital accumulation and the historical development has been built upon?
Well, we definitely need to have idealism. If we don't have ideals, then we won't have any idea what we're trying to achieve.
Okay.
And I think the ideal is not some kind of absolute egalitarianism. The ideal is to have a system in which people are rewarded for effort, and we don't have anyone who is rewarded simply for monopolizing resources. That's the system we have now. Mostly, the highest rewards go to those who have somehow, through force or fraud or inheritance or whatever, simply have a privilege. They own something that they don't do anything to add value to. And the centimillionaires and billionaires are largely living on that. And
absolutely, that's the way they make money. That's the way it grows. Yeah, they've got the collateral. They can build. They can do it. They run everything, just like feudal estates.
We buy chewing gum. They buy chewing gum companies.
Right.
I mean, it's just they operate in a completely different order of magnitude.
That's right, and they get income for not doing anything. They're not tied into the labor theory of value, except voting on a board of directors. But because they have the ownership, and the ownership is so narrowly held. Mr. Reagan they passed a tax cut. It went to the upper 1/100th of 1% of the population at the pinnacle of the society. And why do we accept that? And are we going to do away with private property? It's all owned by a few. Why don't we disseminate ownership of private property, or maybe through land value tax or through George's view, some way ownership getting to the people? And do you think Keynes is right that we're going to be confronted with technological unemployment as we have systems that are overwhelmingly productive and don't need human labor, and all the idea of distributing by labor or contribution it's maybe out of date with a thing, or we don't want to accept a system where that's only left for the poor, and the rich will be able to have ownership of everything, and will limit the ownership capability for the masses of the people as an instrument of income distribution? I don't know if you can follow what I'm saying. How can we allow all the means of production be owned by a tiny group rather than by the mass of the people if there's going to be technological displacement of labor in the productive process with automation and these kind of things that are coming exponentially, so that people would be free to do what it is they want to do rather than what they have to do in order to get a salary by the people who own all the assets, like a feudal pattern out of which history brings us.
I think a large number of people are concerned about the growing disparity of wealth.
Yes, and the inapplicability of the system by which we operate coming out of history in terms of what the future requires. Your film is directed at trying to bring an alternate vision.
The question is what, first of all, it seems to me the question is waking people up to the fact that that's the way the system operates. The system is fundamentally unfair.
Unjust.
And
unfair and unworkable.
Yes.
Okay, unsustainable is the term. Okay.
And as long as people tend to see the problem in individualistic terms, there won't be any solution. The way economists define poverty is they talk about it in terms of low levels of human capital. That means people didn't get enough education.
Yeah, right.
So, I mean, again, we have a very individualistic approach to the problem. And from day one of the way economics is taught, they talk about the market as an exchange mechanism. And they say, I will give you this and you give me something in return. And they don't ask about how is it that you got to be a billionaire and I have nothing?
And why should we accept that? You know, I mean, why do we accept that as something that's like God-given or something?
Economists literally just will not talk about that topic. I mean, it is said that's somebody else's issue. That's sociology. That's not economics.
Right.
Economics is about how to have equal exchange, even though we start with inequality. And we don't. And for one reason that happens in economics is economics does not ask historical questions. It doesn't want to know how we got here.
They're too limited.
It just starts. It operates in a timeless vacuum.
Like our CIA won't talk to the FBI, and it's all tunnel vision. It's all specialized tunnel vision, and they encourage that. The people who run things encourage people to get people so specialized they can't think about the whole and become a threat to the guys that run it all, if I may. That's a maybe cynical view of things.
I'm glad you mentioned the CIA, because one of the most important features of this movie, The End of Poverty.
Yeah, right. And everybody go see it. It's coming out tomorrow. I was from the day.
Well, it's coming out
13th. Right?
It's coming by the time this is viewed, it will be in Los Angeles and then subsequently in other cities.
Good. Let's
get
it out. It's a step in the right direction. Yeah, but go ahead.
But most people think there is poverty in the world. We're aware of it, and the way to solve it is to give things, to give more. We should provide more foreign aid, for example. That's what Jeffrey Sachs is saying. We need to provide more aid to the poor people of the world. It's essentially an act of charity. And the focus of our film is saying it's not a question of charity, it's a question of justice.
All right, good.
That charity is saying we